All right, students. So, welcome to a whole nother video with Miss Enriquez. I figured out a way to put my face on the camera and get this stuff on here, so you guys get to see my face again in case you guys missed it, because I miss your guys' faces all the time. But let's get into this video. So, we want to go over what I had you guys doing on Desmos. So, let's go over some of these questions, selecting all that apply to a cosine graph and to a sine graph. So, looking at a cosine graph, we want to figure out what will apply to this cosine graph given just the general form. We know the period of a cosine graph determines the length needed to complete one full cycle. Well, that's true, except the period is not determined by 3 pi over b. Somehow you guys did that on that one video quiz that we took, and I don't know why, so this is not an answer. The midline is determined by the value of c and is written as the equation of a horizontal line, which is y is equal to c. That is true, so we will say that one's true. The amplitude determines how high or how low from the midline a graph goes. That is true. That's the definition of midline or of amplitude. The period of a cosine graph determines the length needed to complete one full cycle. The period is determined by 2 pi over b. That is true. The midline is determined by the value of b. Not true. It's determined by c. And then when a is greater than 0, the 5-point pattern is max, midline, mid, or minimum, midline, and then max. Or when a is less than 0, it's max, midline, minimum, midline, and max. The answer would be a when a is greater than 0. So that means that you're going to start at your max, because remember this is a cosine graph. You start at your max or your min, depending on if a is greater than 0, then you're starting at your max. If a is less than 0, then you're starting at your minimum. All right, so that one was done. It was just, oh, why did I put an X on that one? Just a check mark, yeah. So those 4 options were the correct answer. So you guys didn't get all of those. Some of you guys are still marking this 3 pi over b. Again, I don't know where you guys are getting that from. 2 pi over b is how you determine the period. And then the value of b, just a reminder, the value of b is the frequency of the graph from 0 to 2 pi. So how many times is this graph going to oscillate or do all those up and down movements between 0 and 2 pi? So that's what b is. All right, select all that apply to a sine graph. Well, it's the same exact things as a cosine graph, except so we know this 5-point pattern. So a 5-point pattern, remember in a sine graph, they always start at the minimum or at the midline first. So either at 0 or the midline. So right there in the middle. And then if a is greater than 0, that means it's going to go up to our max first. So this answer is not true because this needs to be max. So that's not true. If a is less than 0, then it's going to go from our midline down to our minimum, to our midline, to our max, back down to our midline. So this answer was true. Again, you guys all had a randomized order in this, so if you guys looked at somebody else's, you might have gotten it wrong. Again, this 3 pi over b applies to nothing, so it must be the period of a sine graph determines the length needed to complete one full cycle. The amplitude determines how high or how low. That is true. And the midline is determined not by the value of b, but by the value of c. All right, so let's go into creating a table for the following function, and then you guys end up graphing it. I'll let you guys do the graphing part on your own, because if you guys do this table correct, you got the graph correct. So we need to first look at what's our midline. Well, your midline is y equals c, or c, but in this case, we have plus 0 at the end here, so that means that our midline is y is equal to 0. So we're going to use our x-axis as our midline. All right, and then you need to determine the amplitude. Well, the amplitude is the absolute value of -2, which is just 2. So that means that we're going to go 2 above and 2 below. So we know that our max, we can determine the max by taking our midline and adding 2 to it, or adding the amplitude, which means we're going to take 0 plus 2, which our max will be 2 on our y-axis, and the minimum will be taking the midline and subtracting the amplitude. Okay, so if we subtract the amplitude, we go 0 minus 2, which is -2. All right, and then the period. Period will be 2 pi over b, which b in this case, here's your b, is just going to be pi. Your pi's cancel out, so your period is 2. So it goes from 0 to 2 to complete one full cycle of this graph. All right, now let's determine our 5-point pattern because that helps us out. We know our value of a is actually less than 0. So a is less than 0, which means since it's also a sine graph, we still, no matter what, start at our midline. We go to our minimum, our midline, max, back down to your midline. So once you hit your midline for that second time, that's when you did one complete cycle. So let's look into what are these x values that we're going to use. Well, that's where you're going to use your 5-point pattern. If we're starting at our midline on our x-axis, our midline comes from here. So our midline is 0. Then we go to our minimum. Our minimum is going to be 0 minus 2, which is -2 is our minimum. So then we are going from 0 to -2, back to our midline, which is 0. Our maximum is 2, and our midline is 0. All right, that is totally not correct. So I'm going to have to redo this part. Erase what we just did. These are all going to be your y values. These are your y values. That's what those determine. They determine your y values. Oh, goodness. What is wrong with me? So your 5-point pattern determines your y values, which are based on your midline and your amplitude. Your x values come from your period. Use the period to start this. All right, your x values, you're always starting there at the origin because it's a sine graph. Goodness. And then your x values are determined by your period. So you know your last point, your 5th point, will be at 2 on our x-axis. And then we need to divide that by 4. So if we divide it by 4, half of that will be 1. Half of 1 is 1/2. And then we have 3 halves. Between 1 and 2 will be 3 halves. So here's your table of values. If you plug these table of values in to the next page, you'll get the correct graph. Oh, goodness. Let's go down to the next problem. Let's see if I can explain this one correctly. Okay, so for this one, you want to start with your midline. Midline is the value of c, and in this case, that's y is equal to, here's your value of c, which is -1, so y equals -1. Determine your amplitude, which is going to be the absolute value of 5, which is just 5. And then let's determine our max and our mid values. So remember our max value, we take our midline and we add 5 to it, or we add our amplitude. So midline and you add your amplitude, which is 1 plus our amplitude is 5, which our maximum number will be 6. So the max height will be 6. The minimum height will be your midline minus your amp, right? Because we got to go below it. So that's where we're going to subtract it. So we have 1 minus 5, which gives us -4. So your graph is going to go up to 6 and down to -4. We can determine the period by taking 2 pi, and dividing it by b. So if you guys look over here, you can see the value of b. There's a non-existent value of b. There's just an x there. X is your x-axis. You always have a y and an x in your equations. So what is that value of b? It's just going to be the invisible coefficient, which is just 1. b equals 1, so our period will be 2 pi over 1, which is just 2 pi. All right, so your period's 2 pi. So we know for our x values, you use your period, so you're going to start at 0, and then you have 5 points. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4. Your 5th point will be that period, so that'll be to the end of it. And then you need to split that up in 4. So well, half of 2 is just pi. This one would be pi over 2, and then 3 pi over 2. So similar to what we had before, but we just have that pi in there as well. If you guys plug these numbers into that table on Desmos, it turns it into a decimal for you. So when you go to plot the points on the graph, it's much easier. You'll see the decimals so you guys can plug it in. So you can just plug in 2 pi, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and it'll give you those decimals for you. Or just plug it into your calculator. Same difference. All right, period. And then we need to determine our 5-point pattern. All right, 5-point pattern. It's a sine graph. Sine graph always starts at our midline. So no matter what, we're starting at our midline. And then we know that our A value is equal to 5, which is greater than 0. So it's going to go from our midline to our maximum, to your max, back down to your mid, to your minimum, and then up to your midline again. So remember, your max was 6, and then your midline was -4. Your midline, this is where it gets a little tricky. Your midline, you have to use this as your midline. You said y is equal to -1. So that's going to be your midline here, and here, and here. So that's your midline values. So that's going to be -1, -1, and -1. So put that into your y value column. So midline is -1, then to our max is 6, -1, -4, back up to -1. All right, plot these into your table. Plot the y equals 5 sine of x minus 1 into the equation part and see if that line goes through these points. It should. Almost positive we did this right. Obviously, can't figure this out today, but we will figure it out together, and I'm pretty sure that's what you should get. All right, creating a table for the following function, 6 cosine 2x plus 1, the midline. The midline is going to be y is equal to c, so your value of c is 1. And then your amplitude is the absolute value of 6, which is just 6. Now your max will be your midline plus your amplitude, which gives you 7. And then your minimum is your midline minus your amplitude, which is -5. And then the period, well, that is 2 pi divided by b. b in this case is equal to 2. So 2 pi divided by 2, which is just pi. All right, so let's fill in your x values. You're always starting at 0. Your 5th point will be pi. Now the points in between. Take your period and divide it by 4. And you get pi over 4. So that means that your values are going to be increasing by pi over 4. So 0, and then we have pi over 4, add another pi over 4. You will get pi over 2, or take pi and divide it by 2. And then this last one will be 3 pi over 4. So they all increase by pi over 4. So that's where I got those numbers. And then determine your 5-point pattern. So a is equal to 6, which again is greater than 0, but in this case it is a cosine graph. So since it's a cosine graph, we start at our max, then go to our midline. So we're always starting at our max or our minimum first, and that's how you know it's going to be a cosine graph. And then to your minimum, to your midline. Once you hit your max, again, you are good to go. So remember, in this case, our max is going to be that 7. Our minimum is -5. So that means that our max is 7. Our minimum is -5. We need to make it back to 7. Your midline is determined by that c value. So c is 1. So let's translate this to our y column. So your y column, 7, 1, -5, 1, and 7. All right, again, plug this into that table, plot those points, and then put the graph through it, and then you're good to go. Okay, matching the graph to the appropriate function. Well, here's the answer key. Answer key is a little tough, but here's your answer key. This cosine one, if you click on the graph on Desmos, you can zoom in. So you can see whether this cosine of 5 pi of x plus 4, you can see whether it started at the max or the min. So on here, I can't click it because I just screenshotted it. But if you look at it, you know that you had two options on there. You had these two are very similar, but you had to click on the graph to see it. So remember, cosine starts at your max or your minimum. Sine starts at the midline. And then if you look at these two were the similar ones. What helps me when I look at these is that this -2 means that your graph is moving down. Your midline is going down to -2. So that helps me match my -2s. Knowing that the graphs, if you zoom in, your graph has a midline here at -2. That's how I knew that both of these matched with the -2 graph. And then after that, I determined my amplitude in cosine. Well, cosine means it starts at your max or your minimum, and your amplitude is -2, so it's got to go 2 below that midline for cosine, which means it's going to start at your minimum. For your sine graph, it's sine, so you know it's going to start at your midline. For here, our midline was here at -2, and notice that it starts at our midline. Then it goes down to our minimum, to our midline, to our max, midline, back. Or once it hits your midline again, that's one full cycle, and then it keeps going. And then the other two, this one. So I determined this one by, again, cosine always starts at your max or your minimum. This graph, we didn't change our midline. Our midline was 0. So then I had to determine, okay, does it start at my maximum or does it start at my midline? If it starts at your max or your minimum, it's cosine. This one on our y-axis, it starts here at our midline. So we know that that one is a sine function. So that's what helps me for that. All right, and then what are the questions? How do you determine the max or the minimum points on a graph? You can use the midline. And then to determine the max, you're going to take your midline and add your amplitude to it. Your minimum, you are going to take the midline and subtract the amplitude. So that's how to find it algebraically. If you're looking at the graph, you're going to find your midline. How high did you go and how low did you go? That is going to be your amplitude, but you have to look for that midline first to figure out what's that maximum point. What's the difference between a sine and a cosine graph? Perfect. Sine starts at the midline. And then cosine starts at max or min. Max if a is greater than 0, minimum if a is less than 0. All right, those should be your answers for these ones, and that's all of them. So you guys have a review assignment to do today that you guys can work on, and then post any questions about it into our discussion board for this week.